Greetings, intrepid time travelers. Ever play a cosmic lottery where your birth date is the ticket? Tonight, we're not aiming to win, but to avoid the absolute worst moments in history to be alive. From plagues to crumbling empires, we'll explore eras where survival was a terrifying daily gamble. Get ready to be grateful for modern plumbing. If this dive into historical misery piques your curiosity, a like and subscribe would be amazing. Tell us where you're watching from and the time. Now, let's dim the lights and begin our dismal journey into the past. Welcome back. We've spun history's often cruel wheel of fortune. Now let's be clear, we're not just cataloging personal bad luck. We seek entire eras where misfortune was the norm for millions. This isn't about isolated tragedies, a failed crop, a single lost battle. We're exploring lifetimes steeped in systemic hardship, where daily life hummed with a quiet dread, and the future offered little beyond the next ordeal. The question isn't just if it sucked, but how deeply, how widely, and for how many did existence become a relentless trial? We want to understand the baseline of suffering in these dark times. What defines this systemic misery we're investigating? It's crucial to distinguish it from individual grief or localized disasters. Systemic misery is hardship woven into a society's very fabric, its laws, economy, and culture. Imagine your life valued only for its utility to a distant ruler or a local strongman. Picture societies where brutal labor began in childhood, leading to an early grave, often a direct result of that relentless toil. Think of justice as a privilege for the few, not a right for all, where the powerful's whims were cruel, arbitrary law. This is the landscape of institutionalized despair we aim to map. Our focus is squarely on the average human, the silent majority often airbrushed from grand historical narratives. We're talking about the peasant farmer, perpetually insecure, surrendering most of their hard-won yield. Consider the conscripted soldier, a mere pawn in endless, bloody conflicts waged for reasons beyond their ken. Think of the woman whose entire life, from birth to death, was rigidly constrained by oppressive patriarchal norms, her potential systematically denied. Or the child laborer, robbed of youth, their small hands powering nascent, unforgiving industries. Their collective, unrecorded story is the true measure of an era's bleakness. Objectively measuring suffering across desperate eras and cultures is of course fraught with complexity. How can one truly weigh the terror of an unchecked plague against the soul-destroying reality of enslavement or the constant gnawing hunger of famine? Yet, despite these challenges, certain historical periods undeniably stand out. These are the times when a perfect storm of calamities converged. Incessant warfare, devastating pandemics, rigidly oppressive social orders, widespread food scarcity, and a near-total absence of recourse or hope for the common person. These weren't just bad decades, they were sustained epochs of intense human suffering. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine simpler times, but this nostalgia often ignores a brutal daily reality. While progress isn't always linear, certain fundamental aspects of modern life, even flawed access to medicine, the nascent concept of universal human rights, some degree of social mobility, starkly illuminate the profound harshness of many past existences. For most of humanity, for most of history, life was a precarious venture, lived constantly on the knife edge of catastrophe, where a single illness, a poor harvest, or Lord's displeasure could mean utter ruin for an entire family. Why delve into these historical low points, these chronicles of woe? It's not for morbid fascination alone, though the shadows of the past hold a certain grim allure. Understanding these depths of human suffering provides essential perspective. It can highlight the genuine, albeit uneven, progress humanity has made, fostering a deeper appreciation for the relative peace and security many of us experience today. Furthermore, it serves as a sobering reminder of how societal structures and choices can either profoundly amplify suffering or, conversely, work towards its alleviation. History offers stark lessons in both regards. This exploration is not an attempt to create some macabre league table of historical misery, a suffering Olympics where we rank eras by their awfulness. Instead, our goal is to understand the texture of life during these exceptionally challenging periods. What were the prevailing fears that shaped daily consciousness? What were the constant, grinding anxieties that plagued ordinary people from dawn till dusk? How did the systemic cruelty or indifference of an era impact the human spirit? Did it invariably crush individuals, or did it in some instances forge extraordinary resilience against overwhelming odds? We seek the pervasive atmosphere of these bygone ages. Thus, the cradle of calamity, as we've titled this chapter, isn't a single geographical location or one isolated catastrophe. It symbolizes the critical convergence of factors, social, political, environmental, medical, that conspired to make life extraordinarily and consistently suck for the average person. We are setting the stage, establishing a framework for our deeper investigations. In this series, we will continue to pull back history's often gilded curtain, not to marvel at the pomp of kings and conquerors, but to peer into the dim, frequently brutal realities faced by the vast, forgotten majority. Prepare to truly comprehend why, for so many, for so long, history was an ordeal. Our journey into history's most miserable moments now descends into an epoch so notorious for its alleged bleakness, it's often called the Dark Ages. We're focusing on the period immediately following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, roughly 500 to 800 CE. While historians debate the term's accuracy, for the average person clinging to existence in post-Roman Europe, life became a terrifying scramble in a world that had lost its moorings. The grandeur of Rome was fading into memory, replaced by a brutal, uncertain present, where simply surviving the next season felt like a hard-won victory. The fall of Rome in 476 CE wasn't a single cataclysmic explosion that leveled cities overnight, but more like a colossal structure, weakened by internal decay and external pressures, finally crumbling stone by stone over decades. But when that central pillar of imperial authority in the West finally gave way, the impact on ordinary people was profound and devastating. The unifying force that had provided order, law, and infrastructure across vast territories was gone, leaving a gaping power vacuum and bewildering fragmentation. Imagine the immediate aftermath. The Roman tax collector no longer arrives, but, critically, neither does the Roman legion to protect you from bandits or marauding warbands. Familiar administrative structures dissolved almost overnight. The bureaucracy managing road repair to grain shipments vanished, splintering into 1,000 competing, often warring, local interests. For the common farmer or artisan, this meant their predictable life framework shattered. Who was in charge? Who enforced contracts? Who offered protection? The answers were terrifyingly unclear and inconsistent. Consider Rome's legendary roads, arteries that pulsed with trade, legions, and communication for centuries across its vast domain. Without central imperial upkeep, they began to inexorably crumble. Weeds choked paving stones, bridges collapsed, and travel became a slow, perilous undertaking. What was once a safe journey of days could now take weeks, fraught with danger from highwaymen or impassable routes. This physical decay choked long-distance trade, deeply isolated communities, and made news or aid dissemination nearly impossible. It wasn't just roads. Roman aqueducts, incredible feats of engineering supplying cities with fresh water, predictably fell into disrepair. Without them, urban sanitation plummeted disastrously. Grand public baths, vital centers of Roman social life and hygiene, closed or decayed into ruins. Cities, once vibrant hubs of commerce, culture, and population, began to contract sharply, some dwindling into small fortified villages, others abandoned altogether. Monumental Roman architecture became mere quarries or eerie, silent ruins. Perhaps one of an era's most profound casualties was widespread literacy and formal learning. Roman education systems, supporting a relatively literate populace for the time, largely collapsed. Schools vanished, precious libraries were lost to fire, neglect, or outright plunder during invasions. The vibrant intellectual life of parts of the Roman world flickered and dimmed alarmingly. For the average person, the written word became an almost alien, magical concept. Oral tradition and local rumor replaced documented history and broader knowledge. So, who could still reliably read and write in this increasingly shadowed, fragmented world? Primarily, it was the Christian clergy. Remote monasteries became vital, isolated islands of literacy, painstakingly preserving ancient texts, mostly religious scriptures, but also precious fragments of classical learning and philosophy. While this preservation was invaluable for future generations, it also meant access to knowledge, and its specific interpretation became highly concentrated within a specific religious class, profoundly shaping the medieval worldview. With the imperial legions disbanded or absorbed into local forces, a new era of endemic, vicious, localized warfare dawned. No single entity possessed the overwhelming power to enforce lasting peace over large territories. Instead, numerous barbarian kingdoms, Roman successor states, and ambitious local warlords constantly vied for regional dominance through force. Their armies were smaller than Rome's peak, but their conflicts were more pervasive and unpredictable for the common folk living in contested borderlands or fertile plains. This constant low-level warfare wasn't some distant affair for kings and their mounted warriors. It directly and brutally impacted everyday civilian life. Villages were frequently raided for essential supplies, precious livestock, and unfortunate captives often sold into slavery. Fields were torched, humble homes destroyed in punitive attacks. Banditry became utterly rampant on neglected roads and in largely untamed forests. For the peasant family, the threat of sudden, violent disruption by armed men was an ever-present, terrifying reality. Roman law, for all its inherent flaws and class biases, had been a relatively sophisticated, written, and somewhat standardized system across the empire. Its practical collapse in many regions left a gaping judicial vacuum. In its place arose a confusing patchwork of Germanic tribal laws, entrenched local customs, and the often highly arbitrary justice meted out by the local feudal lord or strongman. Concepts like trial by ordeal or trial by combat gained wider traction, reflecting a society grasping for any order. Out of this maelstrom of insecurity, the hierarchical system we know as feudalism slowly coalesced. It was, essentially, a desperate bargain in desperate times. With central authority gone, weaker individuals sought protection from powerful local lords. In exchange for a promise of safety, a place within fortified walls, a lord's armed retinue as a shield, peasants surrendered much freedom, their land, and their labor. They became serfs, tied to the land, their lives dictated by their lord's needs, a steep price for tenuous security. The once sophisticated Roman economy, with its continent-spanning trade networks and relatively stable gold and silver currency, predictably disintegrated. Long-distance trade in anything beyond easily portable luxury goods for the extremely wealthy elite dwindled to a mere trickle. Roman coinage became scarce, often hoarded or melted down, leading to a widespread regression towards inefficient barter economies. Most communities were thereby forced back into basic subsistence agriculture, producing only what they needed to survive locally, severely stunting growth. The intertwined physical and economic fragmentation meant that the known world for most individuals literally shrank to their immediate surroundings. For the average peasant or serf, their entire existence might be confined to their native village and the surrounding few miles of fields and forest. Travel, already made perilous by decaying infrastructure and rampant banditry, offered little incentive if there was nowhere safe to go, and very little surplus to trade. This profound, enduring isolation inevitably bred deep parochialism and suspicion of all outsiders. Life in this era was, to borrow Thomas Hobbes's famous and apt description, often nasty, brutish, and short. Average life expectancy plummeted dramatically compared to Roman times. High infant and child mortality rates were the tragic, accepted norm. Many children simply wouldn't survive to their 5th birthday. Endemic infectious diseases, from dysentery and influenza to leprosy and smallpox, frequently ravaged populations that had little understanding of contagion, hygiene, or any effective medical treatments beyond prayer and herbal guesswork. Imagine the immense psychological toll of living daily in such a visibly decaying world. All around were the crumbling, awe-inspiring monuments of a far grander, more organized and sophisticated past. Roman aqueducts, ruined villas, vast, empty amphitheaters. This constant visual reminder of lost glory must have been profoundly demoralizing. Fear became an almost constant companion. Fear of violent raids, fear of winter starvation, fear of inexplicable disease, fear of the dark, unknown wilderness pressing in. Superstition often rushed to fill the void. So, why did it suck to be alive in post-Roman Western Europe c. 500–800 CE? Because the societal structures providing security, opportunity, justice, and predictability had largely evaporated. Life for most became a relentless struggle for survival in a violently fragmented, dangerous, and intellectually shadowed world. There was little hope for social betterment, scant access to justice or learning, and the constant threat of violence or premature death haunted everyone. It was an age where progress seemed stalled or reversed, and the future, for many ordinary individuals, looked no brighter than a long, grim, uncertain twilight. Having navigated the fragmented world left by Rome's collapse, we now turn to a catastrophe of a different, yet equally horrifying biological nature: widespread disease. In the mid-6th century, as Emperor Justinian dreamt of restoring Roman glory, an unseen, insidious enemy quietly arrived. The Justinian plague, beginning in 541 CE, wasn't just another grim hardship of the Dark Ages. It was a biological cataclysm, arguably the first terrifyingly widespread pandemic, demonstrating just how fragile human civilization truly was. This harbinger of unparalleled misery first emerged, historians generally believe, in Pelusium, a bustling port city in Roman Egypt, in the pivotal year 541 CE. From this gateway, likely carried by infected rats and their fleas, hidden among vital grain shipments for the capital, the plague began its relentless silent march. It spread with terrifying speed along Mediterranean trade routes, an interconnectivity that now became a fatal vulnerability, devastating coastal cities first. The silent, microscopic killer, Responsible for this immense devastation was a bacterium we now know all too well, Yersinia pestis. This was the very same ruthless organism that would, many centuries later, unleash the even more infamous Black Death upon medieval Europe. In the 6th century, however, humanity had absolutely no concept of germ theory, nor any truly effective means to combat its deadly advance. It was a mysterious, seemingly supernatural force of pure, unmitigated terror. The symptoms, as vividly recorded by contemporary chroniclers like the historian Procopius, were horrific and brutally swift in their deadly progression. Victims would first experience a sudden, inexplicable, raging fever, often accompanied by debilitating chills and profound fatigue. Then came the agonizing telltale sign, the growth of large, extremely painful swellings or buboes, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. The body's lymph nodes desperately trying to fight delirium and coma often followed. Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, became a horrifying, congested epicenter of the fast-spreading plague. A densely populated metropolis, one of the largest cities in the world at that time, it was tragically perfectly suited for the plague's rapid transmission. At its dreadful peak, the death toll in the capital was utterly staggering, with Procopius claiming many thousands perished there daily. The empire's vibrant heart became a city of the dying. The sheer, unrelenting scale of daily death utterly overwhelmed urban centers and their basic services. Normal societal functions simply collapsed under the immense strain. There were not enough healthy people left to tend to the sick and dying, nor, critically, to bury the rapidly accumulating mountains of dead. Mass graves were hastily dug, but soon even these could not cope. Bodies were reportedly left in street piles, dumped into the sea, or stacked in city wall towers. Mortality rates were nothing short of catastrophic, reshaping demography for many centuries to come. Modern historians estimate that the Justinian plague ultimately wiped out between 25 to 50 million people across its various devastating waves. In heavily affected urban areas like Constantinople, it's believed that up to 40%, perhaps even a staggering 50%, of the entire population perished in just the initial outbreak. Across the Byzantine Empire, a quarter to a third of its people may have vanished. The psychological impact on survivors was profound, deep, and long-lasting. Unrelenting, paralyzing fear became the defining emotion of this terrifying new era of existence. With no understanding of the disease's mysterious transmission, every unexplained fever could signal impending, agonizing death. People became deeply suspicious of one another. Some turned to frantic piety, while others, believing the end was nigh, gave themselves over to reckless, fatalistic hedonism. Scapegoating also reared its ugly head. The medical practitioners of the 6th century, for all their learning based on classical texts, were rendered utterly helpless against the terrifying onslaught of Yersinia pestis. They possessed no truly effective treatments for this horror. Attempted remedies ranged from dangerous bleeding and purging to applying bizarre herbal concoctions or religious amulets. Some terrified doctors, observing the clear contagion, understandably refused to treat victims, while other courageous souls tended the sick, often succumbing themselves. Emperor Justinian I himself contracted the dreaded plague, but, remarkably for the time, managed to survive it, though he bore its scars, both physical and likely mental. His administration, already stretched thin by ambitious wars and vast building projects, struggled desperately to cope with the unfolding disaster. Edicts were issued for burials and public order, but the state's capacity was crippled by the immense loss of officials, soldiers, and vital taxpayers. His grand vision suffered a severe, lasting blow. The immediate economic consequences were predictably devastating across the entire empire and its trading partners. With vast swathes of the working population dead or too ill to function, critical labor shortages quickly arose in all sectors. Fertile fields went unplowed, harvests rotted, and workshops fell silent. Trade, already disrupted by the plague's spread, ground to a virtual standstill. The price of essential goods and any available labor skyrocketed due to scarcity, causing rampant inflation. In the long term, the Justinian plague significantly weakened the Byzantine Empire's very foundations, accelerating certain declines. The massive depopulation severely strained its military capabilities, leaving it far more vulnerable to determined external enemies like the Sasanian Persians and, later, the Islamic caliphates. It hampered economic recovery for generations and contributed to a shift in geopolitical power. Some argue it was a key factor marking the true end of classical antiquity's vibrancy. Social structures, already under considerable stress in a rapidly changing world, were fractured further still by the plague's relentless, indiscriminate assault. Entire families were tragically wiped out in weeks, leaving behind countless orphans and vacant disputed properties. The widespread loss of skilled artisans, experienced administrators, and hardy farmers created critical voids that were exceedingly difficult to fill for many decades. Traditional community bonds were severely tested by pervading fear. This was no easily contained localized disaster. The Justinian plague respected no man-made borders or formidable geographical barriers. While the Byzantine Empire was its most documented victim, the pestilence spread far throughout the Mediterranean basin, affecting Italy, Spain, Gaul, and North Africa. It also pushed deep into the Sasanian Empire in Persia. There is compelling evidence it reached as far north as the British Isles and possibly even into Central Asia along the ancient Silk Road trade routes. Crucially, the abject horror did not simply end with the first devastating outbreak of 541 to 549 CE like a single terrible storm passing. No, the Justinian plague insidiously returned in recurring, agonizing waves approximately every generation or so, for over 2 long and brutal centuries, not fully receding until the mid-8th century. While subsequent outbreaks varied in intensity, they ensured a long shadow of fear and instability hung constantly over the Byzantine world, hampering recovery. For those unfortunate souls living through these terrible, plague-ridden years, daily life was irrevocably defined by the omnipresent, chilling specter of imminent, agonizing death, and a widespread, soul-crushing despair that permeated all society. The Justinian plague didn't just kill tens of millions, it hollowed out societies, shattered economies, and seared itself into the collective psyche of the 6th century. It stands as a brutal testament to how profoundly existence could suck when an invisible microbe brought civilizations to their knees. In our grim survey of history's worst epochs, few events evoke such visceral, widespread terror as the one we confront now. Imagine a storm gathering on the vast steppes of Inner Asia, a human tempest of such unprecedented destructive fury that it would redraw the map of the known world in torrents of blood. The 13th century unleashed the Mongol Invasions, an era when these nomadic horsemen, often likened to the biblical horsemen of the apocalypse, erupted onto the world stage, leaving a horrific trail of shattered empires and smoldering cities. This cataclysm was largely the creation of one extraordinary man, Temujin, later known to history as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. Forging disparate, endlessly warring Mongol tribes into a single, unified, disciplined, and utterly ruthless nation by 1206, he then unleashed their fearsome collective might upon an unsuspecting and unprepared world. His genius lay not just in brilliant military strategy, but in creating a state geared entirely and brutally for relentless conquest and expansion. The Mongol military was a sophisticated machine of terrifying efficiency, unlike anything most settled civilizations had ever previously faced or imagined. Their core strength lay in vast cavalry armies of hardy mounted archers, capable of incredible speed, astounding endurance, and complex tactical flexibility on any terrain. Masters of feigned retreats that lured experienced enemies into devastating ambushes, they also employed advanced siegecraft learned from conquered peoples. The initial thunderclaps of this devastating global storm struck perilously close to their homeland in Northeast Asia. The Tanga kingdom of Shishya was among the very first to feel their sustained wrath, repeatedly invaded and eventually utterly annihilated. Then came the turn of the powerful Jin dynasty in northern China. Its great ancient cities, once vibrant centers of high culture and bustling commerce, were besieged, systematically starved, and ultimately sacked with truly horrifying brutality by the relentless invaders. With East Asia reeling from these initial shocks, Genghis Khan then turned his formidable gaze westward in the 1210s, towards the incredibly wealthy and expansive Khwarezmian Empire, which stretched across Persia and much of Central Asia. Provoked by the Khwarezmian Shah's incredible folly in murdering Mongol envoys, a grave insult, the Khan unleashed a campaign of such deliberate, systematic, and pitiless destruction that it became tragically legendary for centuries to come. Mongol siege warfare was always a terrifying spectacle of methodical, cold-blooded destruction against any settlement that resisted. If a city dared to defy their summons to surrender, its fate was invariably sealed in blood. They would conscript captured local populations, brutally driving them forward as human shields against their own people, or forcing them to fill moats and undermine fortified walls. They also expertly utilized captive engineers to build ever more sophisticated siege engines. The term massacre barely does justice to the Mongols' calculated policy in regions that offered stubborn resistance or rebellion. Upon capturing a defiant city, soldiers were often given explicit license to kill indiscriminately for days, or tasked to systematically execute the entire populace, sometimes section by section with detached cruelty to ensure absolutely no one escaped their dreadful net. Chilling contemporary accounts tell of massive pyramids of severed human heads erected. The sheer, unadulterated terror inspired by the Mongol approach and their fearsome reputation led to massive, desperate flights of civilian populations across vast distances. As verifiable news of their unspeakable atrocities spread, often intentionally amplified by the Mongols themselves as a tool of war, terrified people by the tens of thousands abandoned their homes, their precious fields, and their cities, hoping vainly to outrun the seemingly unstoppable tide of horsemen. When the Mongols decided to make a particularly brutal example of a resistant city, they didn't just conquer it, they often sought to utterly erase it from the very face of the earth. After a prolonged stubborn resistance, or a perceived slight, entire urban centers were methodically leveled to the ground. Buildings were torn down stone by stone. Vital Qanat irrigation systems essential for agriculture were deliberately destroyed, and fertile fields were sometimes even sown with salt. The campaign of destruction wasn't limited to human lives and physical infrastructure. It extended catastrophically to priceless, irreplaceable cultural and intellectual heritage. Great libraries containing centuries of accumulated knowledge, magnificent mosques, ancient churches, renowned observatories, and famous centers of learning were systematically plundered, desecrated, and often burned to the ground. The 1258 sack of Baghdad saw the Abbasid Caliphate's glorious capital utterly devastated. In the 4230s and 1240s, the terrifying Mongol storm, now under Genghis's successors, swept with full force into the disparate lands of the Kievan Rus. Disunited politically and militarily, caught by complete surprise, the various Rus principalities tragically fell, one by one like dominoes. Cities like Ryazan, the great Kiev itself, and Vladimir were besieged and mercilessly sacked, their populations systematically slaughtered or driven off into miserable slavery. This initiated the long Tatar yoke. Europe watched in absolute horror and growing panic as the Mongols, under brilliant commanders like Subutai, pushed ever further west with seemingly irresistible force. Poland and Hungary bore the brunt of particularly devastating campaigns in the fateful year of 1241. At major battles like Legnica and Mohi, numerically superior European knightly armies, though fighting with accustomed bravery, were tactically outmaneuvered and utterly annihilated by superior Mongol strategy and mobility. Panic gripped the continent. For those unfortunate populations who survived the horrific initial onslaught and found themselves living under the subsequent Pax Mongolica, a peace bought at an almost unimaginable price in blood and treasure, life was an extremely precarious existence under the harsh Mongol yoke. While the empire did eventually establish and protect vast trade routes, it also came with truly crushing levels of taxation, often collected with notorious and brutal efficiency by appointed overseers. Psychological warfare was an undeniable cornerstone of all Mongol conquests, refined over decades to a chilling art form of intimidation. They deeply understood that raw fear could be as potent, if not more so, than any conventional weapon in their arsenal. Stories of their almost inhuman brutality, frequently exaggerated by the Mongols themselves, were deliberately and widely spread ahead of their advancing armies to demoralize any potential opposition into quick submission. The environmental devastation wrought by the Mongol invasions was also profoundly significant and long-lasting, though it is often overlooked in purely military histories. In Persia and Mesopotamia, for instance, the invaders deliberately destroyed ancient and incredibly intricate Qanat irrigation systems, which had supported productive agriculture in otherwise arid lands for many centuries. This single act turned vast, fertile regions into desolate wastelands. Estimating the total number of human deaths directly attributable to the full span of the Mongol conquests is a grim and exceedingly difficult task for historians, but sober figures often range from 20 million to as high as a staggering 60 million people across Eurasia. Some demographic studies suggest that China's population, for example, may have tragically halved during the extended period of Mongol invasion and subsequent consolidation of power. While the later establishment of the famed Pax Mongolica did indeed facilitate transcontinental trade and communication across Eurasia, famously enabling remarkable journeys like that of Marco Polo, this chapter rightly focuses on the sheer, unmitigated horror of the initial invasions themselves. For the countless millions who perished in burning cities, who were systematically massacred in cold blood, or who died of exposure and starvation while fleeing as terrified refugees, any future peace was a tragically irrelevant concept. The primary brunt of Mongol fury and destructive capacity fell overwhelmingly upon densely settled agricultural and sophisticated urban populations across the continents. Farmers saw their precious crops systematically destroyed, their villages burned to ash, and their families brutally scattered or killed. City dwellers, rich and poor alike, faced the unmitigated horrors of prolonged siege, starvation, disease, and then indiscriminate slaughter if their leaders dared to offer any form of resistance. Contemporary chroniclers from diverse cultures, stretching from China to Persia and onward to the alarmed states of Europe, visibly struggled to find adequate words to describe the sheer horror they personally witnessed or heard about through credible reports. Their harrowing accounts are filled with vivid descriptions of rivers literally running red with human blood, of vast landscapes littered with countless unburied corpses, of entire ancient cultures seemingly on the very brink of complete annihilation. The 13th century Mongol invasions were, without any need for hyperbole, truly apocalyptic for countless communities and entire nations across two vast continents. The sheer unprecedented scale of the organized violence, the calculated and refined use of terror as state policy, the methodical obliteration of great cities and ancient cultures, and the absolutely staggering loss of human life, firmly cemented this era as one of the most terrifying and sucky periods in all of recorded human history. Our relentless exploration of history's bleakest chapters leads us to an era where the enemy wasn't a conquering army or swift plague, but insidious, inescapable starvation. We arrive in early 14th century Northern Europe, on the cusp of a calamity so profound it's remembered as the Great Famine. For millions enduring it from first Re 1, 5, 1, 3, 1, 7 and beyond, life became a desperate struggle against an empty stomach in a merciless, changing climate. The years leading up to 1315 had for the most part seen a period of relative prosperity, agricultural expansion, and significant population growth across Europe, often referred to as the medieval warm period. But this beneficial era of milder weather patterns and generally bountiful harvests was ominously drawing to a definitive close. In the fateful spring of 1315, an alarming and catastrophic shift began. Unrelenting, torrential rains started to fall relentlessly across much of northern Europe. It wasn't just a bad spring. It was a prolonged, unceasing deluge. The immediate, devastating impact of this almost biblical scale of rainfall was a comprehensive collapse of the agricultural cycle. Vital grain crops, wheat, barley, oats, and rye, which formed the very bedrock of the medieval European diet, rotted unseen in the thoroughly waterlogged fields before they could possibly ripen. Precious seeds washed away entirely or simply failed to germinate in the cold, constantly sodden earth. The harvest of 1315 was, by all accounts, an unmitigated, widespread disaster of terrifying proportions. The Great Famine's cruel and impartial grip was felt most acutely across a truly vast swath of northern Europe, impacting nearly every kingdom and region, from the entirety of the British Isles, England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, to the fertile lands of France, the densely populated Low Countries, modern Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, across Scandinavia, the numerous German-speaking lands, and stretching as far east as western Poland and the Baltics, the grim story was heartbreakingly similar. As the bleak year of 1315 bled miserably into an even more desperate 1316, any flickering hopes for a swift recovery and return to normalcy were brutally and comprehensively extinguished by the heavens. The relentless rains returned with a dreadful vengeance, often accompanied by unseasonable cold. The previous year's catastrophically meager harvest meant that all food reserves were already dangerously, critically depleted. Crucially, much of the precious seed grain, absolutely essential for the next planting season, had already been consumed. The dreadful year of 1317 marked the absolute nadir of this prolonged, nightmarish agony for many regions, though the deep suffering and its societal repercussions would inevitably linger until around 1322 for a full, albeit slow, recovery. While the destructive weather patterns finally began to slowly return to a more normal state in the summer of 1317, the catastrophic damage was already irrevocably done. 3 consecutive disastrous years of crop failures had pushed society to its breaking point. The physical toll of mass, prolonged starvation was a truly horrifying daily spectacle for all to witness. People grew shockingly gaunt, their bodies emaciated beyond recognition, with deeply hollowed eyes and discolored skin stretched tautly over jutting bones. Chronic, gnawing hunger led to widespread lethargy and apathy, making essential agricultural work, even if theoretically possible, incredibly difficult for the weakened populace. Basic resistance to common diseases plummeted dramatically across all age groups. In the increasingly desperate, frantic scramble for any form of sustenance, people resorted to eating almost anything imaginable, no matter how unpalatable or dangerous. Vital draft animals like horses and oxen, themselves starving, were slaughtered for their tough meat. Cherished family pets, dogs and cats, vanished quietly into cooking pots. People obsessively scoured forests and barren fields for edible roots, forgotten grasses, meager nuts, bitter tree bark, and even, reportedly, handfuls of clay to quiet hunger pangs. The most shocking accounts from this period, though debated by some historians regarding prevalence, speak of the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. Besieged by unimaginable hunger, some reportedly resorted to consuming human flesh, corpses from graves, or even, in darkest tales, preying on the vulnerable living. Whether widespread or isolated, the stories reveal the desperation. As meager food supplies dwindled towards vanishing point, the prices for any available grain or other basic foodstuffs predictably skyrocketed to absolutely astronomical, previously unheard of levels. Essential wheat, bread, and other staples became entirely unaffordable for the vast, impoverished majority of the population. Contemporary chronicles from the time lament with despair how even a tiny measure of poor-quality grain could cost a king's ransom. Profiteering by merchants, though widely condemned, undoubtedly occurred. The very fabric of medieval society began to visibly unravel under the relentless, dehumanizing pressure of unending hunger and desperation. Crime rates soared dramatically as starving individuals and organized groups resorted to widespread theft of food, remaining livestock, or anything remotely valuable. Desperate, armed brigands roamed the blighted countryside, preying on travelers. There were credible, horrifying reports of parents abandoning their own young children, simply unable to feed them any longer. This devastating crisis wasn't solely limited to direct human suffering. It also catastrophically decimated essential livestock populations across the continent. The same persistently wet and cold conditions that ruined the vital crops also led to a severe lack of adequate fodder, and simultaneously created ideal breeding environments for a host of debilitating animal diseases. Widespread epizootics, large-scale epidemics among animal populations, swept lethally through cattle herds, sheep flocks, and other crucial livestock. Medieval institutions, both powerful secular governments and the deeply influential church, found themselves largely, tragically powerless to effectively combat a multifaceted crisis of this unprecedented magnitude and geographical scope. Kings and local lords repeatedly attempted to implement strict price controls on grain and other foods, but these well-intentioned measures often backfired spectacularly, inadvertently leading to rampant hoarding by those with means or fueling dangerous black markets for the desperate. The Great Famine exacted a truly brutal and indiscriminate demographic toll across the length and breadth of Northern Europe. It is conservatively estimated by historical demographers that between 10% to as high as 25% of the entire population perished miserably between 1315 and 1322, primarily due to outright starvation or opportunistic diseases that preyed on weakened bodies. In some severely affected towns, parishes, and remote villages, the localized death rate may have been even catastrophically higher. Malnutrition on such a vast continental scale inevitably left the surviving population exceptionally vulnerable to a host of infectious diseases. Severely weakened immune systems simply could not fend off dangerous infections that might otherwise have been shrugged off as minor ailments in better times. Devastating outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, typhoid fever, influenza, and other virulent pestilences frequently swept through the starving, huddled communities, adding yet another horrific layer of suffering and death. The long-term economic consequences stemming from the Great Famine were undeniably profound, multifaceted, and far-reaching across several decades. The massive, tragic loss of life directly led to significant labor shortages in many sectors, and in some areas, a temporary yet noticeable increase in real wages for surviving skilled workers. However, it also resulted in vast tracts of abandoned farmlands and a severe contraction in overall agricultural output for many years to come, stunting recovery. Imagine, if you can, the deep psychological scars that must have been etched indelibly into the minds and souls of those unfortunate enough to have lived through these horrifying years of relentless, gnawing hunger and profound personal loss. The inescapable trauma of watching loved ones, especially children and the elderly, slowly starve to death, of witnessing widespread societal breakdown, and of enduring constant, debilitating fear would have been truly immense and life-altering for an entire generation. The Great Famine of 1317 wasn't just an isolated, unfortunate spell of bad weather and poor harvests. It is widely considered by many eminent historians to be a key, brutal component of a wider, more protracted period of crisis in the early to mid-14th century, an era sometimes referred to as the Great Slump, or the crisis of the late Middle Ages. It marked a grim turning point, signaling the definitive end of centuries of relative European expansion and prosperity. While famine was tragically an all-too recurrent threat in the precarious pre-industrial world, the Great Famine of 1317 still stands out starkly in historical annals due to its sheer, unprecedented geographical scale, its agonizingly prolonged duration, and its terrifying, all-encompassing severity. It wasn't localized to a single unfortunate kingdom or isolated region. It was a continent-wide shared ordeal that stretched menacingly across multiple dreadful years, relentlessly grinding down millions of hapless people. To live as an ordinary person in Northern Europe during the Great Famine was to experience a world descending into a slow, agonizing hell of mass starvation. It was a time of helplessness against nature's fury, where the cry of hunger replaced daily sounds, and societal bonds stretched to breaking point and beyond. The stench of death, decay, and despair hung heavy, a testament to why this period unequivocally sucked. Just a few decades after the Great Famine had loosened its terrible grip, leaving Europe weakened and deeply traumatized, an even more terrifying specter loomed large. This time, it wasn't the slow agony of starvation, but a swift, invisible, merciless killer that would earn the chilling moniker, the Black Death. Arriving in 1346, this pandemic truly became Europe's Grim Reaper, a cataclysm of such monumental scale it would kill tens of millions, shatter societies, and irrevocably alter history. The culprit, once again, was the relentless bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same microscopic fiend that unleashed the Justinian plague centuries earlier. Its deadly journey in the 14th century likely began on the arid steppes of Central Asia, festering among wild rodent populations like marmots. Transmitted by infected fleas hitching rides on unsuspecting black rats, it spread silently along the burgeoning Silk Road trade routes, a deadly passenger accompanying merchants and their precious goods towards the west. A pivotal, infamous moment in its westward advance occurred at the Genoese trading post of Kaffa in the Crimea, around 1346. Besieged by Mongol forces of the Golden Horde who were themselves terribly afflicted by the plague, a desperate and grim new form of warfare was allegedly employed. According to some lurid accounts, the Mongols then catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls, deliberately infecting the besieged defenders. This act symbolizes the plague's terrifying leap. From Kaffa, its spread was only a matter of time, a tragic inevitability. In October 1347, 12 Genoese trading galleys, their crews already sick and dying, limped into the Sicilian port of Messina. The horrified Sicilians quickly realized these ships carried not just spices but a horrifying, fast-acting death. They expelled the death ships with haste, but it was far too late. The plague had made its devastating landfall in Europe. From these initial entry points, it would explode. The spread was terrifyingly rapid, inexorably following the well-established arteries of medieval maritime and land trade. From Sicily, it quickly reached mainland Italy, Genoa, Venice, Pisa, then on to Marseille and France. It moved like an uncontrollable wildfire through densely populated port cities, then snaked inland along rivers and roads, carried by fleeing refugees, unsuspecting merchants, soldiers, and pious pilgrims. Within a couple years, all of Europe felt its icy touch. The most common manifestation was bubonic plague, so named for the agonizingly painful swellings, the buboes, that erupted in the victim's lymph nodes, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. These could grow to the size of an apple or orange, turning black and putrid. Accompanying this was a sudden high fever, violent chills, uncontrollable vomiting, excruciating muscular pain, and often terrifying delirium. Death, when it came, was usually within 3 to 7 agonizing days. But Yersinia pestis was a versatile, insidious killer, often presenting in even deadlier, faster-acting forms. Pneumonic plague directly infected the lungs, causing victims to cough up blood and allowing highly efficient airborne transmission from person to person, making it terrifyingly contagious and almost invariably fatal within 1 or 2 short days. Even more swift and deadly was septicemic plague, where the bacteria directly overwhelmed the bloodstream. In a world without any concept of germ theory, the true causes of this great pestilence were a terrifying, profound mystery, leading to desperate and often tragically misguided explanations. Many devoutly believed it was a direct divine punishment for humanity's collective sins. Others blamed unfavorable astrological conjunctions or miasma, poisonous, corrupted air. Tragically vulnerable minorities, particularly Jewish communities, were widely and falsely accused of deliberately poisoning wells. Medieval medicine, with its firm reliance on ancient humorism and extremely limited understanding of human physiology and disease, was utterly powerless against this onslaught. Physicians, if they even dared approach the infectious victims, could offer little more than useless folk remedies, dangerous bloodletting, or lancing of buboes. Many brave doctors themselves perished. The iconic beaked plague doctor costume, though more prominent later, symbolized the era's desperate, fearful responses. The sheer scale of death during these years was almost incomprehensible, unlike anything Europe had ever previously experienced or could have imagined. Modern historical estimates suggest that between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death tragically wiped out anywhere from 25% to a staggering 50% of Europe's entire population, potentially 75 to 200 million precious human lives lost. In some particularly hard-hit regions, the mortality rate soared even higher, depopulating entire villages. The very fabric of society frayed and, in many devastated places, completely tore apart under the immense strain. Fear of contagion led to heartbreaking abandonments. Parents deserted sick children, husbands left dying wives, and the afflicted were often walled up in their homes to perish alone. Fields lay untended, shops closed, and law and order weakened. Even basic community services collapsed. The catastrophic loss of so much human life created an immediate and acute labor shortage across all sectors of the European economy. With so many peasants and vital agricultural workers dead, there were simply not enough hands to plow fields, sow new crops, or bring in harvests, leading to localized famines. Skilled artisans, construction workers, and miners also perished in huge numbers, crippling essential industries and stalling major projects for decades. Traditional burial practices, sacred and deeply ingrained, were quickly and tragically overwhelmed by the sheer volume of corpses. Cemeteries filled to overflowing capacity, and there were too few healthy individuals left to dig enough individual graves or conduct proper Christian funerals. Last rites, so crucial for the soul's passage, were often impossible to obtain. Authorities resorted to digging vast, open plague pits into which thousands of bodies were unceremoniously dumped day after day. The psychological impact on the shell-shocked survivors was truly immeasurable, instilling a pervasive sense of terror, profound grief, and inescapable existential dread. Death was no longer an abstract future concept, but an omnipresent, immediate daily reality for everyone. This collective trauma found poignant expression in art and literature, with the danse macabre, or dance of death, becoming a popular chilling motif, depicting skeletons leading all to their graves. Human reactions to this overwhelming, inexplicable horror varied wildly across the continent and social spectrum. Some, truly believing the end of the world was at hand, adopted a stark carpe diem philosophy, indulging in wild, unrestrained hedonism, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we surely die. Others, conversely, turned to extreme forms of religious piety and public penance, desperately seeking divine atonement to halt the pestilence. The Black Death precipitated a profound, multifaceted religious crisis throughout Christendom. The Church, seemingly unable to explain the catastrophe satisfactorily or offer truly effective solace or protection, saw its perceived authority and immense prestige significantly eroded in the eyes of many. Many questioned why an omnipotent God would unleash such indiscriminate, widespread suffering upon the faithful and innocent alike. This disillusionment arguably contributed to later reform movements. In their overwhelming terror and utter confusion, desperate people frantically sought scapegoats to blame for their suffering. As in previous European crises, Jewish communities across the continent became tragic targets of horrific, entirely unfounded accusations and subsequent brutal, organized violence. Falsely blamed for causing the plague by poisoning wells, thousands were tortured into confessions and then mercilessly massacred by frenzied mobs or officially burned at the stake. The immediate economic consequences were, of course, utterly devastating. International trade severely disrupted, vital industries crippled, and overall agricultural output plummeting dangerously. However, the complex long-term effects were surprisingly transformative for European society. The drastic reduction in population led to severe labor shortages, which, in turn, greatly empowered surviving peasants and urban workers, allowing them to demand higher wages and better conditions. The society itself was profoundly reshaped by this demographic earthquake. The rigid hierarchical structures of feudalism began to visibly loosen and in some areas crumble. With far fewer people competing for resources, land became more readily available for many survivors. Some peasants gained greater personal freedom and unprecedented opportunities for social mobility. The psychological shock also spurred important changes in art, literature, and, even slowly, in medical thinking. The Black Death was far more than just a horrifying disease. It was a defining catastrophe that effectively cleaved medieval European history in two distinct halves, before and after. For those who somehow lived through its terrifying reign between 1346 and 1351, daily life became an unrelenting nightmare of constant fear, unimaginable loss, and near-total societal collapse. The Grim Reaper's scythe culled indiscriminately, leaving a depopulated, deeply traumatized continent in its wake. After enduring plague and famine, one might hope for peace. Yet in the 16th and 17th centuries, faith itself, once solace, twisted into a formidable weapon. This period saw Europe convulsed by the wars of religion, decades of brutal conflict where theological differences fueled unimaginable cruelty. Chief among these, the 30 Years' War stands as a terrifying testament to how ideological fervor can unleash hell on earth, especially for ordinary people caught helplessly in the crossfire. The Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century shattered Western Christendom's religious unity. While figures like Luther and Calvin sought spiritual reform, political ramifications were immense. The Peace of Augsburg, 1555, attempted cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion. But this was inherently unstable as Calvinism spread, unrecognized. Underlying tensions between Catholic and Protestant states and within mixed populations simmered dangerously, ready to violently boil over across the continent. The flashpoint for the most devastating of these conflicts, the 30 Years' War, occurred in 1618 with the infamous defenestration of Prague, where Protestant Bohemian nobles hurled 2 imperial Catholic officials from a castle window. This bold act of rebellion against Habsburg authority rapidly escalated from a local Bohemian revolt into a sprawling, complex, and horrifying conflict that engulfed much of Central Europe, drawing in major powers with their own agendas. At the heart of these protracted wars lay brutal religious persecution, often sanctioned and fiercely encouraged by both state and church authorities across the warring faiths. In regions controlled by one denomination, adherents of another were frequently declared dangerous heretics, facing immediate imprisonment, systematic torture, total confiscation of property, forced conversion under duress, or summary execution. Communities turned on themselves with religious hatred. The very nature of warfare itself became demonstrably more savage and unrestrained during this period of intense religious strife. While earlier dynastic wars had their full share of brutality, the wars of religion were charged with a uniquely potent ideological fanaticism. Soldiers on all sides often fervently believed they were fighting God's sacred battles, and that their enemies were not just political opponents, but actual agents of demonic evil, deserving no quarter. Vast mercenary armies, often of enormous size, became the undisputed scourge of the European countryside, particularly within the Holy Roman Empire during the long 30 Years' War. Famous generals like Albrecht von Wallenstein and Count Tilly commanded massive forces composed of hardened soldiers from all nations, bound by loyalty not to a specific cause but primarily to their paymaster and the immediate prospect of rich plunder. These armies lived off the land with impunity. Scorched earth tactics were employed with devastating methodical regularity by all warring parties to gain strategic advantage. Armies deliberately destroyed anything that could sustain the enemy, or indeed themselves, if forced into a hasty retreat. Countless villages were torched, precious crops burned in the fields, livestock slaughtered or driven off, and essential mills and granaries utterly demolished, condemning civilians to starvation. Widespread horrific famine was the inevitable, grim consequence of these brutal military tactics and the general, prolonged disruption of essential agriculture across vast regions, with farmers conscripted, killed, or fleeing in terror, fields deliberately destroyed, and vital supply lines severed. Food production plummeted catastrophically. Civilians in besieged cities or war-torn countrysides faced a slow, agonizing, and inescapable death from severe starvation. Disease, the constant unwelcome companion of war and widespread famine, ran absolutely rampant through the suffering populations. Malnourished, displaced people living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions in besieged towns or makeshift refugee camps were perfect breeding grounds for devastating epidemics. Typhus, often called war fever, dysentery, recurrent bubonic plague, and smallpox swept lethally through both armies and civilian communities alike, claiming countless lives. Siege warfare, a grim hallmark of the 30 Years' War and other conflicts of the era, inflicted truly unimaginable suffering on trapped urban populations for months on end. Cities that chose to resist faced protracted encirclement, completely cut off from all outside supplies and aid. Relentless bombardment by heavy cannon reduced sturdy buildings to mere rubble. Inside the walls, inhabitants endured slow starvation, rampant disease, and the constant gnawing terror of the final, bloody assault. The sack of a captured city was invariably a terrifying descent into utter barbarity and unchecked human cruelty. The most infamous and horrifying example from the 30 Years' War remains the sack of Magdeburg in 1631, where imperial troops under Tilly massacred an estimated 20,000 inhabitants, regardless of age or sex, and then burned the prosperous city almost entirely to the ground. Such horrific events, though extreme, were sadly not isolated incidents. Millions of ordinary people were violently uprooted from their homes and ancestral lands by the relentless cycle of warfare, persecution, and ensuing starvation. Entire communities became desperate refugees, frantically seeking some semblance of safety in fortified towns, remote forests, or perhaps neighboring territories that might offer a temporary respite. This mass displacement created a humanitarian crisis on an immense, almost unimaginable scale across the continent. Unlike some earlier forms of more ritualized warfare where combat was largely, though not exclusively, confined to professional soldiers, the wars of religion saw civilian populations bear the overwhelming, disproportionate brunt of the horrific suffering. There was often appallingly little distinction made by soldiers between an armed combatant and an unarmed non-combatant, especially if the latter unfortunately belonged to the wrong opposing faith. The economic devastation caused by these prolonged conflicts was catastrophic, widespread, and demonstrably enduring for generations. Decades of continuous brutal warfare destroyed vital trade networks, ruined nascent industries, and laid complete waste to vast tracts of formerly fertile agricultural land. States frequently resorted to dangerously debasing their coinage to pay for massive armies, leading to rampant, crippling inflation and widespread poverty. The constant state of intense war and acute deprivation led to a significant, observable breakdown of established social order and cherished moral codes in many of the worst afflicted regions, with legitimate authorities often rendered powerless, corrupted, or actively complicit in abuses. General lawlessness became tragically common. Bands of demobilized soldiers, hungry deserters, and desperate civilians frequently turned to organized banditry merely to survive. The profound psychological toll on those unfortunate generations who endured these brutal religious conflicts is incredibly hard to fully fathom from our modern vantage point. Living under the constant daily threat of sudden massacre, sexual violence, abject starvation, or lethal epidemic disease created a pervasive, corrosive atmosphere of deep fear and lasting trauma. The loss of loved ones, homes, and livelihoods, coupled with the collapse of familiar certainties, left deep societal scars. While the 30 Years' War, 1648 was arguably the most widespread and devastating single conflict of this era, it was unfortunately part of a broader, blood-stained tapestry of religiously motivated European conflict. The French Wars of Religion, 1562-1598, saw horrific atrocities like the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. The protracted 80 Years' War, 1568-1648, for Dutch independence from Catholic Spain, was also heavily fueled by bitter religious differences and persecution. It's absolutely crucial to note that while genuine religious fervor was undoubtedly a powerful motivator and a sincere conviction for many individuals on all sides, these wars were also deeply and inextricably entangled with cynical political calculations and naked dynastic ambitions. Catholic France, for instance, paradoxically but strategically supported Protestant princes within the Holy Roman Empire, primarily to undermine its powerful Habsburg rivals. Rulers often exploited religious grievances. The 30 Years' War, finally, blessedly, ground to an utterly exhausted halt with the landmark Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This complex series of treaties didn't magically end all religious intolerance overnight across Europe, but it did crucially establish new guiding principles of state sovereignty and, to a significant degree, officially recognized Calvinism, thereby redrawing the religious and political map of the continent. The peace was born not of true reconciliation, but of sheer mutual exhaustion. To live through the European wars of religion, particularly in a devastated hotspot like 17th century Germany, was to inhabit a nightmarish world where deeply held faith, for far too many, became a chilling license to kill, to torture, and to destroy without remorse. The bitter, tragic irony of Christ's message of peace and love being widely invoked to justify such widespread, calculated inhumanity was apparently lost on many perpetrators. Civilians invariably paid the ultimate, terrible price. We now turn our unflinching gaze to a chapter of human history so profoundly cruel, so vast in its scale of suffering, it casts a long, dark shadow over centuries. This is the era of the transatlantic slave trade, a meticulously organized system not just of exploitation, but of industrialized, racialized dehumanization. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, millions of African men, women, and children were ensnared in what can only be described as the chains of commerce, their lives fueling empires. While forms of servitude existed in Africa before European arrival, the transatlantic trade was a monstrous distortion driven by insatiable European demand for cheap labor in New World colonies. European traders anchored in coastal forts actively participated in and massively escalated this trade, often exploiting existing rivalries, directly sponsoring brutal raids, or trading firearms for captives to secure a continuous supply of human beings to be treated as mere cargo. The journey into this hell on earth often began with unimaginable, terrorizing violence and betrayal. Villages were ambushed, frequently at night, by heavily armed raiders, sometimes neighboring Africans armed by Europeans. Families were irrevocably shattered as individuals were kidnapped, shackled with iron, and forcibly marched for weeks or even months towards the coast. These coffles, lines of chained captives, stumbled through harsh terrain, enduring brutal treatment and starvation. Along the West African coast, formidable European forts and so-called factories, like Elmina Castle or Goree Island, served as nightmarish prisons, infamous points of no return. Here, captured Africans were held in utterly squalid, overcrowded dungeons, sometimes for many months, awaiting the slave ships. They endured the searing pain of branding with hot irons to mark them as property, and humiliating physical inspections by ship surgeons and captains. The moment of boarding a slave ship to embark on the infamous Middle Passage was one of ultimate abject terror and profound despair for every captive. Torn from their ancestral land, their freedom, and often their last sight of any loved ones, individuals were violently forced below deck into conditions that almost defied human belief. A true, floating hell. The space allocated per person was often less than that of a coffin. Below deck, the fetid air quickly became a poisonous, suffocating brew of human sweat, overpowering excrement, pervasive vomit, and rampant disease. Deadly dysentery, the bloody flux, smallpox, measles, ophthalmia, and scurvy ran wild in these floating dungeons. The intense tropical heat was unbearable, ventilation almost non-existent. The rough wooden floors were often slick with bodily fluids and blood. Physical torment by the ship's crew was a constant, dreadful companion throughout the voyage. Captives were often forcibly brought on deck and compelled to dance for so-called exercise, whipped brutally with cat-o'-nine-tails if they refused or faltered. Crew members, hardened and depraved by the trade, inflicted savage beatings, torture, and rampant sexual violence upon defenseless men, women, and children with impunity. Despite the overwhelming odds and constant threat of death, enslaved Africans courageously resisted their captors in myriad, desperate ways. Some, in ultimate acts of defiance, chose suicide, leaping overboard into shark-infested waters rather than endure more suffering. Others organized dangerous hunger strikes, refusing food despite brutal force-feeding using horrific metal contraptions. Occasionally, brave captives would stage violent shipboard revolts. For those who miraculously survived the multi-week horrors of the Middle Passage, arrival in the Americas, ports in Brazil, the Caribbean, or North America, brought no relief, only a new, terrifying phase of suffering known as seasoning. This was a brutal, systematic process of breaking in new slaves, acclimatizing them to new diseases, unforgiving climates, and the soul-crushing reality of lifelong, hereditary enslavement under a new, often cruel master. The slave auction was a grotesque pinnacle of calculated dehumanization and commodification. Stripped naked regardless of age or gender, men, women, and children were paraded like animals before prospective buyers, their bodies prodded, their teeth inspected, their muscles felt, their wounds and scars critically examined. Families were routinely, callously torn apart, children ripped from their mothers' despairing arms, spouses separated forever, their anguished cries ignored. The vast majority of enslaved Africans were destined for the grueling labor of plantation agriculture, the brutal engine of colonial European wealth. On sugar, cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo, and coffee plantations, they endured relentless, back-breaking, forced labor from before sunrise until well after sunset, typically 6, sometimes 7 exhausting days a week. Under the ever-watchful eye and ready lash of brutal overseers, life expectancy was horrifyingly short. While plantation labor was the most common and often deadliest fate, enslaved people were also ruthlessly forced into other forms of grueling, uncompensated work across the Americas. Many toiled in extremely dangerous mines, gold, silver, salt, extracting precious metals for European coffers. Others were cruelly exploited as domestic servants, constantly subject to the whims, demands, and often violent abuses of their masters and mistresses within the household itself. Brutal, systematic punishment was an absolute cornerstone of the entire slave system, callously used to enforce complete obedience, maximize labor output through fear, and utterly terrorize the enslaved population into submission. The whip, particularly the cat-o'-nine-tails, was a constant presence, its lacerating lash tearing flesh for the slightest perceived infraction. Other common punishments included shackling, branding with owners' initials, and horrific mutilations. The entire horrific system was predicated on a profound, insidious, and systematic dehumanization of African people. Enslaved individuals were legally classified as chattel, mere movable property like livestock. with absolutely no human rights, no legal standing, and no protection whatsoever under the law. Their African names were often forcibly replaced with generic European ones, their diverse languages suppressed, and their rich cultural practices forbidden. Living conditions for the enslaved were typically appalling, designed for mere subsistence at best. They were housed in rudimentary, overcrowded windowless shacks, offering little real protection from harsh weather or disease. Their daily food rations were usually monotonous, meager, and nutritionally deficient, leading to chronic hunger and widespread malnutrition. Clothing was minimal, often just rags. Access to any meaningful medical care was virtually non-existent for most. Despite the unimaginable brutality and the ever-present looming threat of forced separation through sale, enslaved people courageously and tenaciously sought to forge families, create communities, and maintain their humanity. They established intricate kinship networks, skillfully preserved vital elements of their diverse African cultures through powerful oral traditions, music, dance, and storytelling, and developed unique, resilient, syncretic religious practices, often in secret. Resistance to enslavement was not limited to the harrowing Middle Passage. It was an ongoing daily struggle on the plantations, in the mines, and in the cities of the Americas. It took many forms, from subtle, everyday acts like deliberately working slowly, feigning illness, or breaking tools, to more overt defiance like running away, to establish independent maroon communities in remote, inaccessible areas. Occasionally, desperation boiled over into armed revolts. A particularly cruel and defining aspect of this transatlantic slave system was its strictly hereditary nature, legally enforced. Children born to enslaved mothers were, by law and brutal custom, automatically also enslaved from birth, regardless of their paternity, even if their father was the white slave owner. This meant that the heavy chains of bondage were callously passed down from one generation to the next, condemning countless individuals to a life of suffering. The sheer, mind-boggling scale and prolonged duration of the transatlantic slave trade are truly staggering to comprehend even today. Over nearly 4 centuries of its operation, an estimated 10 to 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean, with millions more dying during capture, the torturous march to the coast, or while imprisoned in the deadly coastal dungeons awaiting shipment. This horrific trade was a primary engine of immense wealth. The transatlantic slave trade stands as one of history's most profound, extensive, and prolonged crimes against humanity, a terrifying example of how commerce and greed can lead to the systematic brutalization of millions. For those born into its clutches or ensnared by its evil reach, life was an unending nightmare of extreme violence, utter degradation, and cruelly stolen potential. Its poisonous legacy of racism and inequality tragically endures, a somber reminder of why this epoch made history suck. Our relentless exploration of history's bleakest chapters now brings us to the supposedly verdant fields of 19th century Ireland, a land on the precipice of unimaginable, state-exacerbated suffering. This wasn't a crisis born solely of war or invasion, but of a devastating potato blight, a callous and rigid political ideology, and a profound, lasting betrayal. The Great Hunger and Gort de Mort from 1845 to 1849 saw a proud nation starve while abundant food was exported from its shores under guard. Pre-famine Ireland was a land of stark social contrast and profound systemic vulnerability for its native population. Millions of impoverished rural poor, mostly Gaelic tenant farmers, subsisted on tiny, subdivided plots of land, often rented at exorbitant rates from largely absentee British landlords who cared little for their tenants' desperate welfare. The exploitative system of land tenure encouraged dangerous over-reliance on a single crop. The potato had become the absolute cornerstone of the Irish peasant diet for several compelling, if ultimately precarious, reasons. It was remarkably nutritious when plentiful, could be successfully grown in generally poor soil with only minimal tools, and crucially, yielded a large amount of food from a very small area, essential when access to arable land was severely restricted by landlords. This efficiency, however, created a perilous monoculture. In the late summer and early autumn of 1845, the agricultural bomb tragically detonated. A mysterious, insidious blight, Phytophthora infestans, a wind-borne water mold likely originating in the Americas, arrived with devastating force in Ireland. It spread with terrifying, unstoppable speed through the potato fields. Healthy plants would wither and rot almost overnight, their precious tubers turning into a black, inedible, putrid mush. A foul stench hung over the land. The 1845 harvest saw a significant portion of the vital potato crop lost, perhaps up to half in some severely afflicted areas. This immediately caused considerable hardship and localized distress, but not yet full-scale island-wide catastrophe. The British Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, cautiously responded by secretly importing 100,000 pounds sterling, 0 pence worth, of Indian corn. Peel's brimstone from America, a mostly inadequate and unpopular measure. Any desperate hopes for a better harvest in the pivotal year of 1846 were cruelly and comprehensively shattered. The insidious blight returned with even greater, more terrifying virulence, completely wiping out an estimated 3/4 or more of the entire potato crop across the island. This marked the true, horrific beginning of the Great Hunger. With their sole food source utterly obliterated for a second consecutive year, millions faced mass starvation. As the famine catastrophically intensified, the British government under Lord John Russell, who succeeded Peel in 1846, adhered with almost religious rigidity to a laissez-faire economic ideology. This prevailing doctrine championed minimal government intervention in markets, believing that private enterprise and free trade alone should regulate the economy and somehow provide solutions to starvation, even amidst total crop failure for the poor. The controversial corn laws, which kept British grain prices artificially high to protect landowners, were eventually repealed in 1846, partly due to the Irish crisis. However, this measure did tragically little to help the starving Irish peasantry, who possessed absolutely no money to buy any kind of imported grain, regardless of its price. In a bitter, unforgettable irony, vast quantities of other foodstuffs, oats, wheat, livestock, dairy, continued to be exported from Irish ports. Compounding the disastrous real-world effects of Cowley's laissez-faire policy were deeply ingrained British prejudices and a pervasive moralist view of the Irish people. Many influential figures, publications like The Times, and much of the British public openly depicted the Irish as inherently lazy, ignorant, rebellious, and improvident, thereby blaming their dreadful suffering primarily on their own supposed character flaws, not on British colonial policy. Government relief efforts, when finally and grudgingly implemented, were often intentionally inadequate, cruelly complicated, and disastrously managed. Public work schemes were established, typically requiring already starving men to perform brutally hard physical labor, often building entirely useless roads or famine follies, for pitifully low wages, wholly insufficient to buy food at grossly inflated prices. Workhouses became overcrowded, fever dens, designed as deterrents. Throughout the worst famine years, many absentee British landlords, living comfortably in England, and their often equally callous local agents, continued to ruthlessly demand full rent from their starving Irish tenants. When tenants inevitably fell into arrears, having eaten their seed potatoes and sold their last meager possessions, mass evictions became tragically commonplace. Families were brutally thrown out of their humble cottages, which were then immediately demolished. The physical process of starvation was a slow, agonizing, and deeply humiliating torment for its countless victims. People grew shockingly emaciated, their skeletal bodies consuming themselves from within. Sufferers commonly exhibited famine dropsy, edema, with grotesquely swollen limbs and distended bellies due to severe protein deficiency. Apathy, despair, and a haunting listlessness became common sights as the constant gnawing hunger eroded human dignity. Close on the heels of widespread starvation came devastating rampant disease. Malnourished, weakened bodies possessed virtually no resistance to infection. Typhus, spread by lice and ubiquitously dubbed famine fever, killed hundreds of thousands. Relapsing fever, also louse-borne, and bacillary dysentery from contaminated food and scarce water supplies were rampant. Virulent cholera arrived in 1849, adding yet another horrific wave of agonizing death. Driven by unimaginable, all-consuming hunger, people resorted to the most desperate measures to find anything remotely edible to sustain life a little longer. They consumed common weeds, bitter nettles, slimy seaweed, forest roots, and even diseased, decaying livestock found by roadsides. There were persistent, grim reports of people eating dogs, cats, rats, and even boiled grass. The primal need to survive overrode all other considerations for many starving souls. The dreadful year of 1847, forever known in Irish folk memory as Black 47, is widely remembered as the absolute worst period of the entire Great Famine. The suffering reached its horrifying, almost apocalyptic peak during this relentlessly harsh winter and ensuing spring. A fatal combination of almost total potato failure, grossly inadequate government relief, rampant epidemic disease, and merciless mass evictions led to an appalling, unprecedented death toll. For those desperate Irish who could somehow find the means, or were driven by sheer terror, escape from their starving homeland was the only perceived hope for survival. Mass emigration began on an unprecedented scale, primarily to North America, the US and Canada, and also to Britain. But the perilous transatlantic journey itself was another horrific ordeal. Passengers were crammed into overcrowded, poorly provisioned, and unseaworthy vessels that quickly became known as coffin ships. The Great Famine inflicted a devastating, catastrophic, and lasting wound on Irish society, its unique culture, and its national demographics. An estimated 1 million people tragically died from starvation and related diseases, and another million or more were forced to emigrate during the famine years and shortly thereafter. This massive depopulation, particularly in the Irish-speaking rural West, led to a dramatic decline in the use of the Gaelic language. Private charitable organizations, most notably the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers from both Ireland and Britain, and the British Relief Association, made truly valiant and often heroic efforts to provide essential aid to the starving. They courageously set up soup kitchens and distributed food, clothing, and seeds, frequently working in the most destitute and disease-ridden areas with great personal risk. However, their noble resources were utterly insufficient. The Great Hunger remains an exceptionally raw, bitter, and defining event in all of Irish history, fostering a deep and enduring resentment towards British colonial rule. While the devastating potato blight was undeniably a natural disaster, the widely held perception that British government inaction, its rigid ideological dogma, its economic exploitation, and its callous indifference turned a severe crisis into an avoidable human catastrophe is absolutely pervasive in Ireland and its diaspora. To be an Irish peasant during the Great Famine was to experience the absolute nadir of human suffering and state neglect. To watch your children visibly starve while abundant food was shipped away under armed guard from your own shores, to be cruelly evicted from your home in your weakest hour, to be wrongly blamed for your own destitution by your rulers. The British betrayal was a catastrophic failure of empathy and basic governmental responsibility, leaving Ireland forever marked. We often laud the Industrial Revolution of the 18th-19th centuries as an age of unprecedented progress, a triumphant leap for humanity, but beneath the glittering veneer of innovation and burgeoning national wealth lay a darker, grimmer reality for millions. For the emerging working class, this era was less a glorious dawn and more a descent into the grinding machine, a relentless cycle of brutal labor, abject poverty, and dehumanizing conditions. The revolution commenced with a seismic, often brutal, shift from rural fields to urban factories. Enclosure movements across Britain and parts of Europe consolidated vast tracts of land, ruthlessly pushing countless peasant families off their ancestral holdings and common lands. Robbed of their traditional livelihoods and ancient rights, these displaced rural populations had tragically little choice but to migrate to the rapidly expanding, smoke-belching, and often chaotic industrial towns. The factory system itself represented a radical, disorienting departure from all previous forms of human labor. Work was no longer dictated by the natural rhythms of seasons or daylight, but by the ceaseless, deafening, clattering rhythm of powerful machinery and the ironclad discipline of the factory clock and overseer. These vast, imposing, and often prison-like structures became the new, unforgiving centers of daily life, drawing in entire families. Inside these early, unregulated factories, the working conditions were almost universally appalling and extremely hazardous to health. Most were kept deliberately dark to save on candles, damp from leaking roofs, and dangerously overcrowded with bodies and machines. Poor ventilation meant the air was thick with choking dust, sharp lint, or noxious chemical fumes, leading inevitably to chronic, often fatal, respiratory illnesses amongst the long-suffering workforce. The new machinery itself was a constant, terrifying source of mortal danger to all who worked near it. Whirring, unguarded gears, rapidly spinning belts, and immensely powerful presses maimed and killed workers with horrifying, sickening regularity. Exhausted workers, especially small children, could easily get their hair, loose clothing, or limbs caught, leading to gruesome scalping, crushed bones, or traumatic amputations, often performed without any anesthetic. In the burgeoning smoke-filled textile mills, particularly the vast cotton factories that drove early industrialization, the atmosphere was a choking, inescapable fog of fine cotton dust particles. This inevitably led to bisonosis, or brown lung disease, a chronic, painful, and debilitating respiratory condition that afflicted generations of mill workers, progressively and cruelly robbing them of their very ability to draw breath. High temperatures and extreme humidity added to the misery. For those unfortunate souls toiling deep within the treacherous coal mines, daily life was an unending, terrifying gamble in the dark, suffocating and cramped bowels of the earth. Miners, including many women and very young children in the early days, worked in narrow, unventilated tunnels, constantly at severe risk from sudden fire damp explosions, deadly cave-ins, and terrifying. The relentless inhalation of coal dust led to black lung disease. Workdays during this era stretched to an almost unbelievable 12, 14, or frequently even 16 grueling hours, typically 6 long days a week for men, women, and children alike. The pace of work was utterly relentless, dictated not by any measure of human endurance, but by the unflagging, pitiless demands of the expensive machines and the ever-watchful overseer's whip, or punitive fine system. Profound exhaustion became a permanent, debilitating state of being. Despite these Herculean hours of toil and appallingly dangerous working conditions, wages for the working class were deliberately kept at bare, often below subsistence levels, frequently insufficient to adequately support a single individual, let alone a family. This economic desperation forced entire households, men, women, and their very young children, into the factories, mills, and mines simply to scrape together enough to avoid outright starvation and eviction. Child labor was not just a common feature during the Industrial Revolution, it was a widespread, largely accepted, and often exceptionally brutal cornerstone of the new economic order that enriched the factory owners. Abject poverty and lack of alternatives forced desperate parents to send their children to work at incredibly young ages, sometimes as young as 5 or 6 years old. Employers prized children for their nimble fingers and, above all, their pathetically cheap, exploitable labor. The short lives of these exploited child laborers were often a stolen innocence, a tragic litany of unimaginable daily horrors. They endured the same dangerously long, exhausting hours as adult workers, frequently performing extremely hazardous tasks that led to lifelong debilitating injuries, chronic illnesses, or shockingly early deaths. Beatings by overseers were commonplace to maintain discipline or to keep utterly exhausted children awake at their relentless machine. As desperate people flooded into burgeoning industrial centers seeking any work, towns mushroomed uncontrollably into vast cities with terrifying speed and almost no urban planning or basic infrastructure whatsoever. This chaotic growth led to the rapid creation of sprawling, dangerously unsanitary urban slums. Working-class families were crammed tightly into poorly constructed, overcrowded, and unventilated tenements or squalid, back-to-back houses, often sharing a single outdoor privy. These squalid, refuse-strewn living conditions within the industrial slums were tragically perfect breeding grounds for devastating recurring epidemic diseases. Virulent cholera, spread like wildfire by contaminated water sources, swept through these districts in terrifying waves, capable of killing thousands in mere days. Typhoid fever, typhus, carried by ever-present lice, tuberculosis, previously consumption, and measles were all endemic, preying mercilessly on the malnourished and vulnerable. The very air breathed in these new industrial cities became a thick, toxic, acrid soup that stung the eyes and choked the lungs. Thousands of coal-burning factories and countless domestic hearths belched out unrelenting clouds of thick black smoke, chemical fumes, and fine soot, blanketing entire cities in a grimy, depressing film and leading to the infamous pea-souper fogs. Rivers and canals became little more than open, stinking sewers. A profound and alienating shift occurred in the very concept of time, labor, and daily life for the new industrial workforce. The agricultural calendar, with its inherent natural rhythms, seasonal variations, and task-oriented labor, was brutally replaced by the unyielding tyranny of the factory clock and the shrill blast of the hooter. Bells and whistles rigidly dictated every single aspect of the relentlessly long workday, eroding personal autonomy. In the early formative decades of the Industrial Revolution, ordinary workers possessed virtually no legal rights or effective protections against exploitation. Any attempts to form rudimentary trade unions to collectively bargain for better wages or safer conditions were often met with extremely harsh suppression by powerful employers and government forces, sometimes resulting in imprisonment or even violence. Workers were indeed seen as utterly disposable. Hands. The relentless, all-consuming pressures of early industrial life had a deeply corrosive and damaging impact on traditional social structures and family cohesion. The traditional family unit was severely strained as all able-bodied members, including very young children, were forced into separate, exhausting, and often dangerous labor outside the home. Overcrowding and dire poverty in the rapidly expanding slums contributed significantly to a rise in various social ills. Beyond the undeniable physical hardships and ever-present dangers, the profound psychological grind of early factory life was truly immense and spirit-crushing. The work itself was often mind-numbingly monotonous, endlessly repetitive, and entirely devoid of any intrinsic satisfaction, creativity, or genuine pride in craftsmanship. Combined with the constant oppressive noise, pervasive danger, grinding poverty, and lack of leisure, it created a deep sense of hopelessness. Yet even in these darkest industrial times, the resilient human spirit flickered with defiance and calls for change. Luddites, artisans fearing machinery, destroyed livelihoods, smashed factory equipment. Early clandestine trade unions began to courageously form, fighting for basic rights despite immense, often violent opposition. Some philanthropic reformers also emerged, slowly sowing seeds of change. The Industrial Revolution undeniably forged much of the modern world, paving the way for technological marvels and, eventually, for some, higher material living standards. But for the generations of working-class men, women, and children who toiled in its dark, satanic mills and eked out a miserable existence in its squalid slums, it was a period of profound suffering, relentless exploitation, and a daily, soul-crushing grind. We now plunge into an era that promised national glory but delivered only unimaginable, industrialized carnage, World War I. Dubbed the Great War and, optimistically, tragically, the war to end all wars, it began in 1914 with waves of patriotic fervor and ended in 1918, leaving a continent utterly shattered and a generation cruelly decimated. This was warfare, fully industrialized, where mud and machine guns became the grim, relentless sculptors of a new, terrifying landscape of mass death. The initial spark was a Serbian nationalist's bullet in Sarajevo, but the tinderbox of festering European alliances, unchecked imperial rivalries, and rampant aggressive militarism was already primed for ignition. A complex, entangling web of treaties dragged nations one by one inexorably into the growing abyss. Most young soldiers marched off in the summer of 1914, believing they'd be home by Christmas, their heads filled with naive visions of heroic charges on the critically important Western Front. Initial grand dreams of swift, decisive advances, like Germany's ambitious Schlieffen Plan, quickly bogged down into bloody stalemate. After the First Battle of the Marne halted the German offensive, the infamous race to the sea began as both sides desperately tried to outflank each other. Instead, they dug in, creating a vast, complex, and static network of opposing trenches that scarred the landscape. Life in these rudimentary trenches was a descent into a primitive, subterranean, and utterly hellish nightmare of daily existence. They were often little more than poorly constructed ditches, perpetually waterlogged and freezing in winter, or sweltering and fly-infested in summer. Soldiers lived in constant, unavoidable dampness and indescribable filth, plagued by giant, fearless rats gorging on corpses, and tormented by lice which spread debilitating trench fever. Between the opposing trench lines lay the dreaded no-man's land, a desolate, terrifying, and surreal moonscape of deep, mud-filled shell craters, rotting, unburied corpses, and impenetrable tangled webs of sharp barbed wire. It was an absolute killing field, constantly raked by indiscriminate machine gun fire and opportunistic sniper bullets, a place from which very few who ventured out ever returned alive. At night, patrols would cautiously crawl out to repair wire. The devastating machine gun, more than any other single weapon of the era, starkly defined the horrific defensive superiority inherent in trench warfare. A single, well-placed Vickers or Maxim gun, crewed by just a few men, could easily mow down hundreds of bravely advancing soldiers in mere minutes, turning traditionally heroic charges into utterly suicidal, bloody slaughters. Its rapid, impersonal killing power contributed immensely to the grinding stalemate. Day and night, week after week, the front lines were subjected to colossal, ear-splitting artillery barrages, sometimes lasting for days or even weeks on end, involving thousands of heavy guns on both sides. The sheer, concussive noise was deafening, driving men to the brink of madness. Shells of all calibers rained down, obliterating trenches, vaporizing human bodies, and churning the once fertile earth into a nightmarish quagmire of mud, blood, and splintered remains. The chilling, shrill shriek of an officer's whistle, often followed by a desperate cry, signaled the dreaded stomach-churning order, "Go over the top!" Weighted down with heavy equipment and rifles, terrified soldiers clambered out of their relative safety and advanced across the treacherous no-man's land, often at a slow, agonizing walking pace, straight into a murderous hail of machine gun bullets, exploding shells and shrapnel. Battles like the Somme became synonymous with this futility. A profound, corrosive sense of utter senselessness and bitter betrayal increasingly pervaded the rat-infested trenches as the war dragged on. Soldiers, mired in stinking mud and constantly surrounded by death and decay, frequently saw themselves as mere cannon fodder, their precious young lives squandered by distant, seemingly incompetent and callous generals who stubbornly clung to outdated feudal tactics. The lions led by donkeys sentiment grew with every lengthening casualty list. Adding a terrifying new dimension of insidious horror to this already exceptionally brutal conflict was the widespread, cynical introduction of deadly poison gas by both sides. First chlorine, then phosgene, and most terrifyingly, persistent mustard gas were unleashed upon unsuspecting troops, often drifting silently. These horrific chemical weapons caused agonizing deaths by choking or inflicted terrible chemical burns, temporary or permanent blindness, and severe, lasting respiratory damage. Other frightening new technologies made their grim, bloody debut on the battlefields of World War I. Tanks, initially cumbersome, slow, and mechanically unreliable, rumbled menacingly across the shell-torn landscapes, striking fear but often breaking down or getting hopelessly stuck in the deep mud. Aircraft, at first used only for vital reconnaissance, soon engaged in daring dogfights high in the skies above the trenches. The unrelenting thunderous stress of near-constant bombardment, the ever-present fear of sudden violent death, and the horrific, gruesome sights of industrialized warfare led to a widespread, debilitating psychological condition eventually termed shell shock. Symptoms varied widely, ranging from uncontrollable tremors, terrifying nightmares, and profound memory loss to hysterical paralysis, stress-induced blindness, and complete mutism. Sufferers were often tragically misunderstood. While the Western Front often dominates historical memory, the Eastern Front, primarily a vast battleground between Russia and the Central Powers, was equally brutal and immense in scale, though generally characterized by more fluid movement. It witnessed enormous bloody battles, colossal casualty figures, and widespread, intense suffering among both soldiers and civilians alike due to extremely harsh weather conditions, dire logistical failures, and devastating scorched earth tactics. The grinding misery of the Great War was not confined to these two main European fronts, but spread its tendrils globally. On the treacherous Italian front, soldiers fought bitter campaigns in the freezing, unforgiving conditions of the High Alps. The infamous Gallipoli campaign against the Ottoman Empire proved a bloody, costly disaster for the Allied forces. In the Middle East and across Africa, colonial troops were tragically drawn into the imperial power's distant struggles. For ordinary civilians on the various home fronts, the war brought a different, yet still profound kind of hardship and daily struggle. Essential food items and other vital goods became increasingly scarce due to naval blockades and the insatiable demands of the vast war machine, leading to strict, unpopular rationing across Britain, Germany, France, and other belligerent nations. Millions of women were mobilized to take on traditionally male roles. Heartbreaking grief became a constant, unwelcome companion for literally millions of families across all warring nations. Nearly every household was tragically touched by the death or serious, life-altering injury of a beloved husband, son, brother, or father. People lived in a state of perpetual, gnawing anxiety, fearfully scanning casualty lists in newspapers, and desperately trying to glean any real information through a thick fog of government censorship and propaganda. The war also brought new, direct, and terrifying threats to civilian populations in ways previously almost unimaginable. German Zeppelin airships and later Gotha bombers carried out pioneering, though relatively small-scale, aerial bombing raids on British and French cities, causing civilian casualties and widespread panic. Long-range artillery, like Germany's infamous Paris gun, could indiscriminately shell cities from incredible distances, further blurring the lines. The total human cost of World War I was simply staggering, a figure almost beyond true comprehension or emotional grasp. An estimated 10 million military personnel were killed in action or died of wounds, and over 20 million more were wounded, many permanently maimed, disfigured, or psychologically broken. Millions of civilians also perished due to war, famine, widespread disease outbreaks, and direct military action, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire. The war utterly shattered the optimistic pre-1914 belief in inevitable human progress, the civilizing mission of empires, and the supposed glory of martial combat that had characterized much of the preceding era. Survivors, both soldiers and civilians alike, were often left deeply disillusioned, cynical, and profoundly traumatized by the sheer senselessness of the industrial-scale slaughter they had witnessed or endured, and by the catastrophic collapse of old-world certainties. World War I was a brutal, decisive turning point in human history, a horrifying descent into the full abyss of modern industrialized warfare, fought with terrifying new weapons. The mud and machine guns of the Western Front became enduring, iconic symbols of its utter futility and its unprecedented, horrifying capacity for slaughter. For the millions who endured its trenches, its bombardments, its gas attacks, and its heartbreaking losses, it was a period that unequivocally, profoundly, and catastrophically sucked. As smoke cleared from WWI battlefields in 1918, a war-weary world craved peace. Instead, humanity faced another horrific global conflict against an invisible, insidious enemy, the Spanish flu. This devastating pandemic swept across the planet with breathtaking speed and appalling lethality, quickly killing more than the Great War itself. The precise geographical origins of the H1N1 influenza A virus that caused this global pandemic remain debated by historians and modern virologists. Theories point to Hassel County, Kansas, remote China, or even crowded British Army camps in France. What is clear is that its first relatively mild wave appeared insidiously in the spring of 1918. Strict wartime censorship, desperate to maintain public morale and hide any national weakness, meant news of this spreading sickness was suppressed. Then, in the late summer and early autumn of 1918, just as WWI was reaching its climax, the virus seemingly mutated, or a more virulent strain emerged, unleashing the devastating second wave. This was the true, indiscriminate killer. It struck with horrifying ferocity and speed, spreading like an invisible wildfire across all continents, greatly facilitated by massive global troop movements as soldiers returned home or were tragically redeployed to new fronts while already infected. The pandemic became widely, yet inaccurately, known as the Spanish flu. This was not because it originated in Spain, but because Spain, as a neutral country during World War I, did not impose strict wartime censorship on its press. Spanish newspapers therefore freely and accurately reported on the severity of the epidemic ravaging their nation, including King Alfonso XIII falling gravely ill, making it seem like the epicenter to the outside world. The insidious virus spread with truly astonishing, almost unimaginable rapidity for that era. Carried silently on naval ships, crowded troop trains, and by individual unsuspecting travelers, it reached virtually every inhabited corner of the globe within a matter of months, from bustling modern European capitals to the most remote Alaskan indigenous villages and isolated Pacific islands. Entire communities could be overwhelmed and incapacitated within mere days. One of the most terrifying and scientifically perplexing aspects of the 1918 flu was its shocking, disproportionate impact on young, healthy adults, typically aged 20 to 40, the very demographic normally most resilient to influenza. This unusual lethality pattern led to a distinctive W-shaped mortality curve, with high deaths in the very young, a notable dip in older children and middle-aged adults, and then a sharp, tragic peak in those in their prime. Symptoms were brutal and swift. Victims experienced sudden extreme fever, chills, debilitating headaches, and severe body aches. Many developed hemorrhagic pneumonia, lungs filling with bloody fluid, leading to desperate gasping and characteristic blue/black cyanosis. Some bled from noses, ears, even eyes. Modern scientific understanding suggests a chilling, paradoxical reason for its extreme lethality in the young and healthy, a phenomenon known as a cytokine storm. The robust, well-developed immune systems of healthy young adults may have catastrophically overreacted to this novel influenza virus, releasing a massive, uncontrolled flood of immune cells and chemicals that, instead of fighting the infection, furiously attacked the body's own tissues. Hospitals and existing medical facilities, already severely strained by 4 years of horrific war casualties, were completely and utterly overwhelmed by the sheer tsunami of flu patients. Dedicated doctors and courageous nurses worked themselves to the point of collapse, many contracting the flu and dying themselves, further crippling the already inadequate medical response. Makeshift emergency hospitals were hastily set up in schools, public halls, and even open-air tents. In 1918, the medical world stood largely, tragically helpless against this devastating viral onslaught, lacking the tools of modern medicine. It was the pre-antibiotic era, so the very common secondary bacterial pneumonias, which often delivered the final, fatal blow to flu victims, could not be effectively treated. There were no antiviral drugs. So-called cures and preventative measures abounded, ranging from bizarre folk remedies to dangerous quack medicines. Faced with a rapidly spreading, deadly, and invisible killer, desperate public health authorities across the globe resorted to a range of sometimes drastic, often inconsistently applied measures. Strict quarantines were imposed, often with armed guards preventing movement. Public gatherings were widely banned. Schools, theaters, churches, dance halls, and saloons were ordered closed. Many municipalities mandated the wearing of flimsy gauze face masks in public. The global death toll from the Spanish flu was truly catastrophic, far exceeding Great War combatant deaths. Conservative estimates place it at 50 million worldwide. Some argue up to 100 million or more. 3–5% of the planet's population. India was horrifically affected. Remote communities were decimated. Daily life transformed into fearful existence, dreading contagion. Simple public acts or family interaction became fraught with danger. Horse-drawn hearses were commonplace. Funerals were often brief, with few mourners, or dispensed with. Mass graves were dug. Coffin shortages abounded. The pandemic caused immense, widespread economic and profound social disruption, cruelly compounding the extensive damage already wrought by 4 years of total war. With so many working-age adults either critically sick or dying, businesses closed their doors, factories shut down or operated with skeleton crews, and essential public services like mail delivery, telephone operation, and basic public transport were severely crippled or collapsed entirely. After the devastating peak ferocity of the second wave in late 1918, a third, though generally somewhat less deadly wave of the pandemic unfortunately emerged in the winter and spring of 1919, and in some isolated places even lingered into 1920. While overall mortality rates were lower during this phase, it still claimed many more lives and cruelly prolonged the period of global fear, suffering, and societal uncertainty for many agonizing months. The psychological impact on a world population already deeply traumatized by 4 years of unprecedentedly brutal industrial warfare was truly profound and long-lasting. People lived in a state of constant heightened fear of this unseen, unpredictable, and indiscriminate killer that could so easily strike down the healthiest individuals in their absolute prime of life. The sheer suddenness of death, often within mere days, was particularly terrifying. Pervasive wartime censorship played a significant and detrimental role in how the pandemic was initially perceived by the public and later remembered by history. By deliberately suppressing or downplaying news of serious outbreaks in allied and Central Power nations, various governments undoubtedly allowed the virulent virus to spread unchecked for longer than it might have otherwise. This also directly contributed to the enduring Spanish flu misnomer, shifting perceived blame. The pandemic's devastating impact on isolated indigenous communities around the entire globe was particularly catastrophic and heartbreaking. Lacking any prior exposure or naturally acquired immunity to similar, powerful influenza strains, these vulnerable populations often experienced horrifyingly high mortality rates, far exceeding those seen in more interconnected and previously exposed societies. Entire villages were tragically wiped out, their ancient cultures decimated. For many individuals who managed to survive the acute, life-threatening infection of the 1918 flu, the ordeal was not necessarily over when the fever finally broke. Numerous reports from the time, and some later medical research, strongly suggest that a significant number of survivors experienced debilitating, lingering health problems for many months or even years afterwards, including severe neurological issues, chronic fatigue, and persistent respiratory complications. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919 served as a horrifying, deadly bookend to one of history's most destructive periods, a cruel encore of mass death after the Great War's curtain supposedly fell. It was a terrifying reminder that humanity's deadliest enemies are not always armed, but can be invisible, airborne, and utterly indiscriminate in their lethal harvest.